Why are we starving? A foreword. This book is not about blame. It's about remembrance. Somewhere along the way, we accepted a quiet lie. That scarcity is normal. That exhaustion is the price of living. That hunger, of body, soul, or spirit, is just the way the world works. But that lie doesn't sit right in us. It never has. We look at a world bursting with resources, innovation, food, land, creativity, and connection, and still we feel empty. Still we see people hungry. Still we feel rushed, anxious, divided, and tired in ways sleep doesn't fix. So we ask, sometimes out loud, sometimes only in our bones, why are we starving? Not just for bread, but for meaning. Not just for security, but for peace. Not just for success, but for wholeness. This book doesn't claim to have all the answers, but it refuses to ignore the question. If you've ever felt like something is off, like the world you were promised and the world you're living in don't match, then this book is for you. Chapter 1: A World That Doesn't Make Sense. We live in an age of abundance pretending to be an age of lack. There is more food produced globally than ever before, yet people starve. More houses than families, yet people sleep outside. More technology than imagination, yet people feel disconnected. More information than wisdom, yet confusion reigns. This contradiction is so constant that we've learned to stop questioning it. We're told, that's just how the system works. That's economics. That's survival. But survival was never meant to feel like suffocation. From the beginning, the world was not designed as a cage, it was designed as a gift. Seed-bearing plants. Renewable land. Rhythms of rest. Community before competition. Provision before profit. Creation itself points to abundance. So if the design is abundant, but the experience is starvation, the problem isn't the planet. It's alignment. Somewhere, we stopped asking what the world was meant to be and started accepting what it became. Somewhere, we traded stewardship for ownership. Somewhere, we replaced trust in God with trust in systems that require fear to function. And fear is expensive. Fear makes us hoard. Fear makes us compete. Fear makes us forget that we belong to one another. The deepest starvation in our world isn't a lack of resources, it's a lack of remembering who we are, who God is, and how life was meant to flow. This book is an invitation to remember. Not to go backward, but to realign. Because a world this full should not feel this empty. Chapter 2: When Survival Became a Religion. At some point, survival stopped being a season and became a belief system. What began as a response to uncertainty slowly hardened into doctrine: work more. Store more. Protect yourself. Don't fall behind. Survival became sacred. Security became salvation. We stopped asking, what is enough? And started asking, how do I make sure I never lack? This shift didn't happen overnight. It happened quietly, through systems, expectations, and unspoken rules we learned early on. Rules like, your worth is tied to your output. Rest must be earned. Trust is naive. Scarcity is reality. Over time, these ideas stopped feeling like opinions and started feeling like truth. And once survival becomes the highest good, fear becomes the priest. Fear tells us, there won't be enough later. Someone else will take what's yours. Slowing down is dangerous. Faith is risky. Fear demands offerings, time, health, relationships, conscience. And we pay them willingly because fear convinces us it's keeping us alive. But survival was never meant to be the goal of life. Life was meant to be lived. When survival becomes religion, people stop seeing one another as neighbors and start seeing one another as threats or competitors. Communities fracture. Compassion becomes conditional. Generosity feels irresponsible. We don't hoard because we're greedy, we hoard because we're afraid. And fear is contagious. It spreads through headlines, through algorithms, through conversations that begin with "you better hurry" before. Or you can't trust anyone these days. Yet even in this, something in us resists. We feel it when rest feels rebellious, when generosity feels healing, when slowing down feels like oxygen. Those moments are clues. They remind us that we were not designed to live clenched. The most revealing question is this: if survival is the ultimate goal, why are so many people who have made it still empty? Because survival can keep you alive, but it cannot make you whole. Wholeness requires trust. And trust requires letting go of the illusion of control. This is where faith enters, not as a rulebook, but as a reorientation. Faith says, you are not alone. Provision is not your burden alone. Life is more than what you can secure. Faith doesn't deny reality, it challenges the lie that fear is the only rational response to it. The world tells us to grip tighter. God invites us to open our hands. And here is the uncomfortable truth: a system built on fear cannot coexist with a life rooted in trust. One will always undermine the other. This doesn't mean abandoning responsibility. It means refusing to let fear dictate what kind of humans we become. The question isn't whether we will work, plan, or prepare. The question is, who are we becoming while we do? Chapter 3: The Many Hungers We Don't Name. Not all hunger growls. Some hunger whispers. Some disguises itself as restlessness. Some wears the mask of success. We tend to recognize hunger only when it is physical, when a body lacks food. But there are other forms of starvation that go unnoticed because they don't announce themselves as emergencies. They simply drain us slowly. We are starving for connection in a world that never stops talking. Starving for meaning in a culture obsessed with metrics. Starving for rest in a system that rewards exhaustion. Starving for truth in an economy of attention. These hungers often go unnamed because naming them would require us to question the structure of our lives. Instead, we medicate them. We scroll. We consume. We chase achievement. We stay busy. But busyness is not nourishment. A person can be surrounded by people and still be lonely. A person can be spiritually starving inside a religious environment. A person can be financially stable and emotionally depleted. This is why abundance without alignment feels empty. When physical hunger is ignored, the body weakens. When emotional hunger is ignored, relationships fracture. When spiritual hunger is ignored, meaning collapses. When creative hunger is ignored, people feel invisible to themselves. None of this happens suddenly. It happens gradually, quietly, until numbness feels normal. And numbness is a kind of starvation. We've been taught to ignore these hungers because they're inconvenient. They slow us down. They can't be measured easily. They don't fit neatly into productivity charts or economic forecasts. But God has always cared about the whole person. Not just whether we survive, but whether we are becoming fully alive. This is why Jesus fed people and spoke to their hearts. He healed bodies and restored dignity. He didn't separate the physical from the spiritual. We did that. We categorized hunger. We prioritized some and dismissed others. We treated certain forms of starvation as personal failures instead of communal warnings. But hunger, any hunger, is information. It tells us something essential is missing. The question isn't whether hunger exists. The question is whether we are willing to listen to what it's revealing. Because every form of starvation points back to the same fracture: we are disconnected from God, from one another, and from the rhythms we were created to live by. This chapter isn't meant to diagnose everything. It's meant to help you notice. Notice what feels empty. Notice what feels rushed. Notice what you keep silencing with noise. Those places are not weaknesses. They are signals. And signals can guide us home if we let them. Chapter 4: The World We Were Meant to Live In. Before there were systems, there were rhythms. Before there were markets, there was morning and evening. Before there were policies, there was soil, seed, sun, and rain. The world was not designed as a machine to be optimized, but as a garden to be tended. In the beginning, provision was not something to be chased, it was something to be received. Work existed, yes, but it was relational, not oppressive. Naming, tending, cultivating. Participation, not exploitation. Creation itself carried limits, not as punishment, but as protection. Rest was built into the design. Enough was part of the pattern. This matters because it tells us something essential. The original vision for life did not require constant striving. The land was meant to be shared. Time was meant to be honored. Community was meant to be interdependent. No one was meant to carry everything alone. When Scripture speaks of dominion, it does not mean domination, it means responsibility. Stewardship. Care. Accountability to the giver of the gift. But somewhere along the way, dominion was reinterpreted as entitlement. We stopped asking, how do I care for what I've been given? And started asking, how much can I extract? That shift changed everything. When extraction replaces stewardship, the land suffers. When extraction replaces stewardship, people become resources. When extraction replaces stewardship, abundance collapses into inequality. This is not just an environmental issue. It's a spiritual one. Because the way we treat the world reflects the way we understand our place in it. If we see ourselves as owners, we exploit. If we see ourselves as stewards, we protect. If we see ourselves as guests, we give thanks. The world we were meant to live in was not naive or fragile. It was resilient because it was relational. Even the laws given later, to leave fields unharvested at the edges, to forgive debts, to rest the land, were reminders of this original rhythm. They were not burdens. They were safeguards against forgetting. Forgetting who provides. Forgetting who we belong to. Forgetting that life is meant to circulate, not accumulate. We were meant to live in a world where sufficiency was normal, not suspicious. Where rest was obedience, not laziness. Where generosity was wisdom, not risk. That world was never fully erased. Its memory lives in us every time we long for simplicity, fairness, or peace we can't quite explain. That longing isn't fantasy. It's recognition. Chapter 5. Who taught us to live this way? No one wakes up one day and decides to forget God. Forgetting happens gradually, through repetition, through reward, through fear dressed up as wisdom. We learn how to live long before we ever question why we live the way we do. From an early age, we are taught what matters. Be useful. Be competitive. Be efficient. Be careful. These lessons aren't always spoken. They're modeled, reinforced, praised. We learn which behaviors are rewarded and which are punished. We learn what is considered realistic and what is dismissed as idealistic. We learn which questions make people uncomfortable, and eventually, we stop asking them. This is how systems teach without ever announcing themselves. Most of what we call common sense is simply normalized survival logic. It says, don't trust too much. Don't give unless you're sure. Don't rest unless you've earned it. Don't challenge the structure, it's bigger than you. Over time, this logic reshapes our understanding of God as well. God becomes distant, conditional, concerned primarily with behavior instead of wholeness. Faith becomes another performance metric. But this version of God doesn't match the one revealed in Scripture or in creation. The God of abundance gets replaced with a God of scarcity. The God of daily bread gets replaced with a God of contingency plans. The God of presence gets replaced with a God of productivity. This isn't usually malicious. It's inherited. Every generation passes down not only wisdom, but fear. Not only faith, but adaptations made under pressure. And many of those adaptations made sense once, but were never meant to become permanent truths. When survival strategies harden into beliefs, they begin to override trust. And once trust erodes, control steps in. Control over land. Control over labor. Control over bodies. Control over narratives. History shows us this pattern again and again. Whenever fear becomes institutionalized, hierarchy follows. Whenever hierarchy goes unquestioned, suffering gets explained instead of confronted. People are told their hunger is personal failure. Their exhaustion is lack of discipline. Their emptiness is lack of gratitude. But hunger that widespread is not accidental. It's structural. And structures don't fall apart on their own, they persist because they benefit someone. This is where the question becomes uncomfortable. Not who is to blame, but who benefits from things staying this way. Asking that question doesn't make you cynical. It makes you awake. Jesus asked it constantly, sometimes with parables, sometimes with silence, sometimes by simply refusing to play along. He didn't overthrow systems with violence. He exposed them with truth. He ate with people who had been written off. He healed on days when rest was supposed to be regulated. He challenged leaders who had confused authority with righteousness. Not because he was rebellious for rebellion's sake, but because love always disrupts systems built on fear. The more clearly we see how we were taught to live, the more freedom we gain to choose differently. Not recklessly. Not arrogantly. But consciously. Because you cannot realign with God while remaining unconscious to what pulled you out of alignment in the first place. Chapter 6: Following God in a World Built on Fear. Following God has never been the same as withdrawing from the world. It has always meant learning how to live differently within it. This matters because fear-based systems are persuasive. They don't usually threaten us outright, they educate us. They teach us what to prioritize, what to ignore, and what to accept as inevitable. Following God in this context doesn't mean rejecting responsibility or pretending systems don't exist. It means refusing to let fear be the lens through which we interpret reality. Fear says, protect yourself first. Secure your future at all costs. Trust only what you can control. God says something quieter, and therefore harder to hear. Seek first what is right. Do not be anxious about tomorrow. You are not alone in this. These aren't abstract spiritual statements. They are countercultural practices. To trust God in a fear-driven world is not passive, it's active resistance against the idea that anxiety is wisdom. It looks like choosing enough over endless accumulation. It looks like rest that isn't justified by exhaustion. It looks like generosity that doesn't wait for guarantees. It looks like honesty when silence would be safer. This kind of faith often feels impractical at first because it doesn't immediately reward us the way fear does. Fear gives quick feedback: work harder, feel safer, temporarily. Hoard more, feel in control, briefly. Faith works differently. Faith asks us to loosen our grip before we feel secure. Faith asks us to trust provision before we see surplus. Faith asks us to value people over outcomes. That's why faith can feel dangerous in a system that thrives on predictability. But following God has never been about optimizing outcomes, it's been about forming people. People who are not easily manipulated by panic. People who are not owned by scarcity narratives. People who remember where life comes from. This doesn't mean you'll always make the safe choice. It means you'll make the aligned one. And alignment changes how you move through the world. You start to notice where fear is driving decisions, yours and others. You start to recognize when urgency is being used to bypass wisdom. You begin to feel the difference between responsibility and bondage. Following God doesn't remove you from the world's tension. It changes how much authority that tension has over you. You still plan. You still work. You still prepare. But you no longer confuse preparation with salvation. You remember that provision flows, not because you've mastered the system, but because God has not abandoned creation. That remembrance doesn't make life easier. It makes it truer. And truth has a way of loosening what fear keeps tight. Chapter 7: Enough, the most dangerous word. Enough is a quiet word, but it carries explosive implications. In a world that depends on perpetual desire, enough is a threat. It interrupts the cycle. It slows the machine. It asks a forbidden question: if this is enough, what happens to everything built on wanting more? Most systems cannot survive contentment. They require dissatisfaction to function: newer, bigger, faster, better. They rely on the idea that fulfillment is always one purchase, one achievement, one upgrade away. The moment a person says this is enough, their power weakens. That's why we are rarely taught how to recognize enough. Instead, we're trained to move the line. Enough income becomes just a little more. Enough success becomes don't fall behind. Enough rest becomes after this next push. Enough is always postponed. But spiritually, enough is not resignation, it's clarity. Enough says, I am not defined by accumulation. I am not saved by excess. I am not incomplete by design. Enough reconnects us to reality. In Scripture, daily bread was enough. Manna spoiled when hoarded. Wealth was warned against when it replaced trust. Not because provision is bad, but because attachment distorts it. When more becomes the goal, people become means. When more becomes normal, gratitude evaporates. When more becomes identity, scarcity never leaves, no matter how much is gained. This is why people with plenty can still feel starved. Enough is dangerous because it exposes a lie, that our value increases with our accumulation. But human worth was never meant to be earned. Enough creates space. Space for rest. Space for generosity. Space for noticing others. Enough allows us to say, I can stop. I can share. I can breathe. Those statements sound small, but they are revolutionary. A person who knows what enough feels like cannot be easily manipulated by fear. They are harder to rush. Harder to exploit. Harder to convince that someone else's survival requires their loss. Enough restores proportion. It reminds us that life is not a race to the top, but a shared journey. That success without peace is poverty by another name. That abundance without distribution is still starvation, just hidden. This doesn't mean everyone's enough looks the same. Enough is contextual. Enough is relational. Enough requires listening to your body, your spirit, your community, and God. But once you experience it, you recognize its absence immediately. And here's the truth many systems won't say out loud: a world organized around enough would still function, but it would function differently. Slower. Fairer. More human. And perhaps that's why enough is resisted. Because enough returns authority to people, and ultimately, back to God. Chapter 8: Starvation as a Symptom, Not a Sentence. When hunger is everywhere, it's easy to believe it's permanent. When systems feel immovable, we start mistaking them for natural law. When suffering lasts long enough, hope begins to feel irresponsible. But starvation, of any kind, is not a verdict on humanity. It is a signal. Symptoms are not the disease. They are the Buddhist way of saying something is wrong. Hunger tells us there is a disruption in flow. Exhaustion tells us the pace is unsustainable. Loneliness tells us connection has been replaced with convenience. Spiritual emptiness tells us we are living disconnected from our source. None of these mean the system is working. They mean it isn't. One of the most damaging lies we inherit is that the way things are is the way things must be. But history tells a different story. Every major shift toward justice, dignity, and human flourishing began when people refused to accept suffering as normal. Not because they were naive, but because they were awake. Jesus never treated hunger as abstract. He fed people. He never treated suffering as deserved. He healed people. He never treated oppression as permanent. He confronted it. And when people asked why things were the way they were, he didn't shrug. He told stories that revealed the cracks in the system, stories about debt forgiveness, unfair wages, misplaced priorities, and seeds falling into different kinds of soil. He treated starvation as something to be responded to, not explained away. That matters. Because despair often disguises itself as realism. It says, that's just human nature. It's always been this way. Nothing will ever change. But those statements are conclusions, not truths. They are what fear says when it wants the conversation to end. Hope, in contrast, is not denial. Hope doesn't say everything is fine. Hope says everything is unfinished. Starvation is not proof that God has failed. It is evidence that we have drifted from alignment, and alignment can be restored. This doesn't happen all at once. It doesn't happen without resistance. And it doesn't happen without cost. But it always begins the same way, with awareness. With naming what hurts. With refusing to numb it. With choosing to believe that hunger is not the end of the story. The moment starvation is recognized as a symptom, possibility re-enters the room. Because symptoms can be treated. Patterns can be changed. Flows can be restored. The question shifts from why is this happening to what needs to be healed. And healing, real healing, has never been quick. But it has always been possible. Chapter 9: What alignment looks like in real life. Alignment is not an idea. It is a way of moving through the world. It doesn't announce itself loudly, and it rarely looks dramatic. In fact, alignment often appears unimpressive to systems that value scale over substance. But its impact is cumulative, relational, and enduring. Alignment begins when a person stops asking only, "What can I get away with?" and starts asking, "What is faithful here?" That shift changes everything. In real life, alignment looks like choosing integrity when cutting corners would be rewarded. It looks like honoring limits in a culture that glorifies burnout. It looks like listening, truly listening, to what your body, your relationships, and your conscience are telling you. Aligned people still live within systems, but they are no longer defined by them. They work, but work does not own them. They plan, but plans do not replace trust. They participate, but they do not surrender their humanity to efficiency. Alignment also reshapes how we see one another. People stop being competitors and start being neighbors again. Success is no longer measured only by personal gain, but by communal health. Questions change from "How far can I get ahead?" to "Who is being left behind?" This doesn't require perfection. It requires attention. Aligned communities don't wait for permission to care. They share what they have. They notice who's missing. They create margins of time, resources, and compassion because they understand that life happens in those margins. In the early Christian communities, this wasn't theoretical. They ate together. They pooled resources. They made sure needs were met. Not because they were idealistic, but because they believed scarcity was not the final word. Alignment doesn't eliminate hardship, but it changes how hardship is carried. When one person stumbles, others adjust their pace. When one household lacks, others respond. When someone burns out, rest is honored, not shamed. This kind of life doesn't trend well. It doesn't optimize easily. It doesn't scale neatly. But it heals. Alignment is slow enough to notice pain. Strong enough to endure disappointment. Flexible enough to adapt without losing its soul. And perhaps most importantly, alignment keeps God at the center, not as a concept, but as a lived reality. God is no longer consulted only in crisis. God is present in decisions, rhythms, and relationships. Alignment doesn't ask, "What can I afford to give?" It asks, "What has already been entrusted to me?" That question reorients responsibility away from fear and toward faithfulness. And when enough people begin asking it, starvation, of all kinds, starts to lose its grip. Chapter 10: Remembering what we already know. Most of what we need to heal has not been lost. It has been covered. Buried under noise. Crowded out by urgency. Drowned beneath opinions, metrics, and expectations. But buried is not the same as gone. There are truths we recognized instinctively as children before survival logic tightened its grip. Truths about fairness, rest, wonder, and belonging. Truths about how wrong it feels when someone has far too much while another has nothing. Truths about how life feels fuller when it's shared. We didn't reason our way into those truths. We recognized them. That recognition still lives in us. It shows up as discomfort when something feels unjust, even if we can't articulate why. It shows up as grief when we realize how tired we've become. It shows up as longing for simplicity, for meaning, for a life that feels integrated instead of fragmented. These are not weaknesses. They are memory. Remembering doesn't mean rejecting everything we've learned. It means discerning what was added out of fear versus what was rooted in truth. Fear teaches us to override intuition. Wisdom invites us to listen to it again. Remembering God often begins not with learning something new, but with unlearning what never fit. Unlearning the belief that rest is laziness. Unlearning the idea that worth must be proven. Unlearning the assumption that scarcity is inevitable. Unlearning the habit of measuring ourselves against others. This process can feel disorienting. When you stop running on borrowed urgency, there's often a quiet that feels unfamiliar at first. But that quiet isn't emptiness, it's space. Space for reflection. Space for prayer that isn't rushed. Space for noticing what matters. Remembering is not nostalgic. It's clarifying. It brings us back to first principles. Life is a gift. People matter more than outcomes. Provision is meant to flow. God is near. When we remember these things, choices shift. Pace changes. Priorities realign, not because we're trying harder, but because we're seeing more clearly. The world does not need more people who are frantic but informed. It needs people who are grounded and awake. Remembering what we already know doesn't solve everything overnight. But it does restore orientation. And orientation is what allows movement without losing direction. Starvation thrives in confusion. Alignment grows in clarity. And clarity begins with remembering who we are and who we belong to. Chapter 11. What if we lived as if it were true? What if we actually lived as though what we believe were true? Not as ideals we admire from a distance, but as realities that shape our days. What if trust in God wasn't something we reserved for emergencies, but the posture we carried into ordinary decisions? What if enough wasn't a theory, but a practice? What if alignment wasn't aspirational, but expected? These questions aren't hypothetical in the abstract. They're practical to the point of discomfort. Living as if it were true would change our pace. We would move slower where fear tells us to rush. We would pause long enough to notice one another. It would change our work. We would still labor, but without surrendering our souls to it. We would ask not only is this profitable, but is this faithful? It would change our homes. Meals would matter again. Rest would be protected. Presence would outweigh productivity. It would change how we measure success. Success would include peace. Success would consider impact on others. Success would leave room for rest. Living as if it were true would not make us passive, it would make us deliberate. We would spend with awareness. Give with intention. Speak with care. We would stop confusing urgency with importance. This kind of life would feel strange at first, not because it's unnatural, but because it runs against the current we've been swimming in for so long. And there would be resistance. Not everyone benefits from people who are less anxious, less driven by comparison, less willing to trade their humanity for advancement. A calmer population is harder to manipulate. A people rooted in enough are harder to sell fear to. But this way of living would also be contagious. When someone chooses rest without apology, it gives others permission to question their own exhaustion. When someone gives generously without spectacle, it reminds others that provision flows. When someone refuses to panic, it steadies the room. Living as if it were true doesn't require perfection. It requires courage. The courage to trust when fear feels safer. The courage to stop when momentum says keep going. The courage to believe that alignment with God is not a liability, but a foundation. If we lived this way, not all at once, not flawlessly, but sincerely, starvation would begin to lose its grip. Not because resources magically increase, but because flow is restored. And flow is how life was always meant to work. Epilogue: Why we are no longer asking the wrong question. We began with a question that felt unsettling because it refused to stay in one place. Why are we starving? At first, it sounded like a question about food. Then it revealed itself as a question about systems. Then about fear. Then about faith. But by the time we arrive here, the question has changed us. We now see that starvation is not the mystery we thought it was. The deeper issue was never a lack of resources. It was a loss of alignment. We starve when fear replaces trust. We starve when survival replaces stewardship. We starve when accumulation replaces flow. We starve when systems replace people. And most quietly of all, we starve when we forget God. Not forget in name or belief, but forget in posture. Forgetting that provision was never meant to be carried alone. Forgetting that enough is holy. Forgetting that rest is obedience. Forgetting that life is relational at its core. This doesn't mean the world is beyond repair. It means the work ahead is clearer than we thought. The question is no longer why are we starving? It is now. What are we willing to realign? Realignment is not grand. It is daily. It happens in how we spend our time, how we treat one another, how we define success, how we listen to God when fear is louder. The world will not change overnight, but it never has. Change has always come through people who lived differently long enough for others to notice. People who chose enough. People who slowed down. People who refused to let fear have the final word. You do not have to fix everything. You are only asked to be faithful where you are. Because starvation does not end when someone has everything. It ends when enough is shared. And alignment, once restored, has a way of multiplying. This book is not an answer. It is an invitation. To remember. To realign. To live as if what we believe is true. Because a world this full does not have to feel this empty. And it doesn't have to stay this way.